So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the NESA Maritime summer series over a digital platform as a result of the COVID-19 global kind of remote working environment. Today's topic is focused on great power competition and the Red Sea region. And my name is Jeff Payne. I am the Manager of Academic Affairs at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies based in Washington. NESA covers a whole variety of purposes, but our primary mission is global engagement in the region that we cover, which goes from Bangladesh all the way over to Morocco, as well as certain types of professional military education. Today, I'm joined by three prominent experts related to both the Red Sea and/or China's foreign policy. And so we're going to engage in a conversation about these two interconnected issues, the Red Sea region, which is very interesting in its own accord, as well as China's and other great powers' aspirations around the world. So, with no further ado, I will turn the mic over to our first participant to allow themselves to introduce who they are and where they're from. We'll start with Dr. Joel Wuthnow. Joel, to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Jeff. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Joel Wuthnow, a research fellow at National Defense University. I work in the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs. Most of my work is on the PLA, also some work on Chinese foreign and security policy, U.S.-China relations, and mainly on East Asia, although in the last year, Patty and Zac and others got me involved in a U.S. Institute of Peace task force on the Red Sea region, which got me thinking a little bit more about China's role in this region. And so I was glad to participate and to see the rollout of the report from that event last 2 months ago now. But Patty, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that effort.
If you haven't read it, should read with great attention. I was involved in that project a little bit on the boundaries, and there seemed like a lot of great work being done, both on the Red Sea and China's relations in that region. So now we'll turn to Dr. Patricia Kim of USIP, so she can introduce herself. Patricia, to you.
Good afternoon, Jeff and everyone on this call. Thanks so much for inviting me to be here. And I want to apologize first for having a blank screen. My video feed seems to be not working today. But to introduce myself briefly, I am a senior policy analyst with the China program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. I focus on Chinese foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and East Asian security issues. And I've traditionally looked at China's role in East Asia, but after arriving at USIP about a year and a half ago, I also started to work on China-Africa relations and a bit on China-Middle East. And I was the project director of a recently released report that Joel mentioned and that Zac was also a part of on China's growing influence in the Red Sea arena. And so I've been expanding that portfolio over at USIP. I also work on nuclear security issues, and particularly China's nuclear posture and strategy as well.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And I will take the blame for any video problems you have. So you can just blame that on me. So we'll just blame Jeff. That'll be the default rule if there's any hiccups during this conversation. Just blame Jeff. Our final speaker is Zac Burton, who is affiliated with the Brookings Institution. He has done a lot of different projects related to the wider Red Sea region. And so Zac, to you, so you can give greater context on what you're doing and what you're working on right now.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks for inviting me. Glad to be here. As you mentioned, I'm a fellow with the Brookings Institution, both the Foreign Policy Program and our Middle East Center in Doha. And really, over the last 2 years, have been working on a project specifically on the changing geopolitics of the Red Sea. So looking both at local political and security dynamics in the Horn of Africa, the sort of mad dash for influence and access that we saw from Gulf states starting a few years back, and a sort of third tier involving great powers, which is, of course, the topic of our discussion today. So that project's been ongoing, and as you alluded to, I'm working on a report myself on the topic, specifically on China and the U.S. in the Red Sea, but more with a specific focus on China's presence in Djibouti, both its economic and military presence, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But again, before you get to that report, which comes out in a couple of weeks, I do recommend both Joel's report from earlier last year and the USIP report that's been mentioned. Thanks.
Okay, well, everyone seems to have familiarity with each other, so I don't know if there's going to be a lot of discord in the conversation today. That's not necessarily a bad thing. So to launch into the conversation itself, there is a lot of speculation, as a lot of people know, of China's ambitions when it comes to the Red Sea region. Obviously, the opening of their first overseas base in Djibouti drew a lot of eyes to what China is thinking about. There's also wide-scale speculation about the future of the United States as it relates to the wider Middle East, North African region. Is the U.S. withdrawing? Is the U.S. rethinking its security postures? Is it rethinking the geostrategic importance of the Middle East? And there's a host of other, regional as well as major powers who are doing all sorts of various activities that could potentially change this wider region. But today's conversation is focused on great power competition, which doesn't necessarily mean U.S.-China, but in most of the time, the conversation defaults to those two countries. So the first question I have to the group, and we'll start with Joel as the first respondent, is what does it mean when we're talking about great power competition in the Red Sea region? How do you see that? How would you approach that question? Joel, to you.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Well, yeah, so part of this is that there's a context here that the U.S. government, the defense establishment, is increasingly seeing itself as engaged in a competition with China globally, so not just in the Indo-Pacific, but in other regions. The combatant commands have been given the task of preparing for great power competition, including CENTCOM and AFRICOM, which are the relevant commands in this theater. And so we see ourselves in competition, but what does that really mean? And it's kind of hard to define. It's fairly clear, fairly obvious in the Indo-Pacific, but what exactly does that mean in Africa, in Latin America, in other, and in the Red Sea region for today's purposes? I think if you look specifically at the security and military dimensions, it's fairly hard to see that we're actually in a very clear competition with China. And one of the reasons is, laid out pretty clearly in the USIP report, which is that China doesn't really aspire to become a dominant security provider for the region. It's not really trying to displace the United States' traditional role that we've played in the region. It tends to stay out of most of the regional disputes. It doesn't really take sides. China doesn't have alliances in the region, and we have some alliances on our side. China has this military presence that people are talking about, but it's not very big. And certainly in respect to the United States presence, it's really quite small and modest and not focused so much on combat as it is on the sort of peacekeeping and counter-piracy and things like this. In the arms arms exporting, China is a bigger player now, but still it's not, nearly as substantial as the United States. So what exactly does competition mean if they're not trying to become sort of the dominant? So I'm not sure how to categorize it exactly. I think if we look more towards the long term, there are questions that need to be raised and are being raised on both sides, on the US side and the Chinese side, about our access and our maneuverability within the region. So from the US point of view, I think there is concern now that China, with greater diplomatic and economic clout in the region, could try to frustrate our operations, to leverage some of those economic ties, to convince states not to condone US military interventionism, or to frustrate US operations specifically from its limited military presence. On the Chinese side, they have worried for a long time about the US being in a very strong position to impose a blockade in a conflict even outside of the Indo-Pacific. And so planners on both sides worry about what might be around the corner militarily. And yet on the other side, China remains fairly constrained. It's actually, in my view, free riding essentially on the US in the region to maintain those sea lanes and to basically to pay the costs of regional stability and so on. And so I think China has incentives not to get into too much of a competition, and doesn't at this point really have the capacity or the capability to do that. So I guess that's sort of my view in a nutshell. Related kind of corollary question, I guess, is if we're not in a direct military competition or security right now, then is there a basis of cooperation on any of these shared issues, and how should we be thinking about cooperation, and can we cooperate in kind of an environment where everyone thinks in zero-sum terms? Should we demand that China play a bigger security role in doing sea lane protection and things like that? And I think, there are certainly common interests. Our defense strategy talks about cooperation where we have common interests, but when we doubt the other's motive, I think it's very hard to get to practical cooperation. But those are some of the kinds of issues that, we should also try to think about. So let me wrap there.
Joel, I think that's an excellent start. You're jumping ahead. In my flank, this competition is cooperation. Is definitely one of the things I wanted to get into. But I think an excellent starting point for this conversation. Before I give my responses to some things you said, we'll go through everyone. So, Patricia, I will turn the mic over to you for any additional comments or follow-ups you have to what Joel started us with.
Thanks, Jeff. So to get to your question about great power competition in the Red Sea arena, I think there's always been competition in this area over power, resources, and territory by regional and extra-regional states. But this competition has been heightened in many ways and is receiving lots of attention with China's growing presence and influence in this arena. So Beijing has rapidly expanded its economic and diplomatic footprint, and to a lesser extent, its military footprint in the Red Sea region over the last 2 decades, and especially in the last decade, and it's become a significant player as a result. So what we found in the USIP study that we've been talking about since the beginning of this call is that Beijing sees economic engagement as its primary way to win friends and influence in the Red Sea arena, and to protect its key interests, which include supporting its economy and national security by advancing the Belt and Road Initiative, ensuring access to a stable flow of energy resources and trade, protecting the many Chinese citizens and investments that it has out in the region, and finally building ties through various bilateral and multilateral mechanisms that create support for China in the broader international arena. Now, as I said, China's growing economic presence has been accompanied with diplomatic and cultural engagement as well. And China has made great investments to grow its soft power and to build a strong base of support for its activities in the region and in the broader international arena. China has also expanded its military presence in the Red Sea arena over the last 10 years, starting first with its participation in counter-piracy operations and sending peacekeepers to the region, and then by opening its first base in Djibouti in 2017. So this base has received a lot of attention in the media and focus as sort of this epicenter for a rivalry with the U.S. But as Joel said, what we found in this study at USIP is that while there's the expanded military presence is certainly part of China's approach and strategy towards this region, China is not very interested in stepping in as the region's primary security provider or overtaking the U.S. in this particular theater as the premier military power. Now, this isn't to say there aren't short to long-term concerns and implications of China's military presence, but I think it's important to realize that China sees its economic pillar as the most competitive pillar of its strategy towards this region. And it's been relatively successful given the region's enthusiasm for Chinese infrastructure projects, loans, and cooperation on economic development. Now, with the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, there are questions about how Beijing will handle BRI and its vast network of infrastructure projects and loans that are scattered across the developing world, and especially in places like Africa, where leaders are calling for loan forgiveness, and there's going to be a lot of economic damage from the coronavirus pandemic. And this is coming at a time when China's own economy has shrunk by 6.8% in the first quarter of 2020. This is unprecedented. This is the first time in decades this has happened. And Chinese leaders have an unemployment crisis on their hands at home. And for years, Xi has pledged to eradicate poverty and build what he calls a moderately prosperous society by 2020 in China, which is sort of its first step to become a true great power by 2049. And so this goal that's been advertised over and over is really, very much at threat. So Xi and the CCP are facing a great test at home. So BRI engagement, which is the key pillar of China's strategy in this arena, is likely to shrink in the long term, or in the near term, excuse me. But I don't think China is going to completely retrench or abandon its strategy towards this region, given that it underpins its larger goals of economic growth and global influence. So China will likely remain economically, politically, and military engaged in the Red Sea arena for the foreseeable future. And my final point is that, for now, is that America's soft power, influence, and leadership, especially in Africa, has been diminishing for some time as China has intensified its engagement in the region. So if the United States wants to remain relevant, continue to have the ability to shape norms and outcomes in the Red Sea arena, and to help states manage China's growing presence, it will need to significantly increase its own engagement, from high-level diplomacy to commercial engagement, to investing in civil society, institutional capacity, education, and so on. So let me stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Patricia. There's a lot there as well, especially you bringing in the domestic elements of Chinese foreign policy, which, in kind of the international news narrative about, U.S.-China competition, there always is a blind spot, both in looking at the U.S. and looking at China, how domestic politics can drive a lot of overseas activity. So useful data points to bring in. Again, I have even more questions now to ask, but so Zac, I know you're just going to confound my job even more. So I'll turn it to you to round us out on this first question.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, you're on.
Thanks. I wanted to start off by violently disagreeing with both Joel and Patty. No, I'm just kidding. They've covered most of the ground here. I think just to your specific question about why are we talking about this, obviously both have alluded to the sort of expansion of Chinese commercial and strategic expansion here on both sides of the Red Sea, and that's generated concern in U.S. national security circles. And kind of spotlighted it as a potential theater of great power competition. As Joel alluded, this frame has obviously, we all know, come to dominate U.S. national security under Trump, and quickly materialized in this region as well. When former National Security Advisor John Bolton rolled out the administration's new Africa policy, as you may know, was heavily focused on China, and so that theme quickly took root here as well. And I think U.S. officials and military folks in the region are trying to figure out how that fits and how they orient themselves. So I think just for the intro here, I will say, as I do in my forthcoming report, I think it's important that we situate this in a wider context, the wider strategic context, both for Washington and Beijing, and that kind of has two levels. First is the Red Sea itself, where, as I mentioned, we've had this kind of flurry of engagement across the Red Sea as folks set up commercial ports and military bases and are lobbying for influence and access Some of this has been driven in part by China or by a response to China. If we look, for example, and we can talk more about this, about the UAE's port strategy in the region and the future of maritime trade, I think that's in large part a response to China. And all of it shapes the environment in which, all of this activity shapes the environment in which the Chinese and we will have to operate. Second, again, I think this is where our theme today comes in. If you fixate an even wider strategic lens, Chinese presence in the region and including this military outpost in Djibouti that has garnered all this attention, represents the western flank of the wider Indo-Pacific, and that, as many would argue, is the primary theater in which China's continued rise is likely to be negotiated. So I think there's also a second point there we can come back to if of interest on our own geographical conceptions of what constitutes the Indo-Pacific. And I think this is important as we look at sort of competing strategies in the region, or as the U.S. tries to develop its own strategy. Both for us and for the Chinese, how do we see the Indo-Pacific? In some ways, our definition of that is more narrow, that may be expanding. But certainly in the course of my research in the region, I've run into more than a few who have argued that China has arguably a more integrated or more expansive vision of the Indo-Pacific. So I think it's that, and particularly the development of the Chinese outposts in Djibouti that has garnered new attention. Obviously, that establishment broke some sort of long sacrosanct principles about prohibitions on basing Chinese troops abroad, and yet this is an evolution that I don't think should be surprising or is not illogical, of course, for the Chinese. I think the question, and again, I'll just put a few pins in the wall here to come back to, is what does this mean for us? And I'd wager this is the first, not the last, Chinese base in the region. And so as there's more to come, how do we posture ourselves? Is this something that we withdraw from and further this narrative of withdrawal, or is it an opportunity, in my view, as it is, to shape U.S.-Chinese relations going forward, an opportunity really to set precedents? Thanks.
Zach, thank you. Okay, again, you're making my job very, very hard because there's so much there are like 16 different meals we could have right now intellectually. Just my reactionary comments really quickly is that I think that bringing up the idea of domestic politics, as Patty did, was key. I think Joel pointing out about essentially how we evaluate China, like when it comes to this specific Red Sea region, like we shouldn't overemphasize its impact, nor should we dismiss it. It's really about the U.S. deciding for itself an effective response as it relates to the Red Sea theater. And then Zach, your point about the Indo-Pacific in general, how we define it, how the Chinese kind of see a similar concept, whether they frame that within the BRI or some other kind of narrative, also is critical. But the specific follow-up I want to ask, and this might be a little bit of a cheat question, but a lot of the work that NESA does focuses on engagement with Middle East and North African states. So we have a lot of conversations about the Red Sea with officials, academics, military officers from this region. And they, even though in absolute terms there is no comparison between the US footprint and the Chinese footprint in this region, but there is this narrative that is wide-ranging and very popularly expressed in the wider MENA region about the US being on decline and therefore leaving, and China on the rise and one day being preeminent. Yeah, they may not be ready for preeminence right now, but they will. So I don't want to get into the actual discussion about long-term trends. I want to get into the perception. How would you, if this was a problem put on your desk right now, how would you respond to that perception challenge? Because it seems to be something that a lot of people in the Red Sea region, when they're thinking about China and the US, are focused on. And we'll switch up the order. Zach, we'll start with you, and we'll go from there if you have any response.
Sure. I'll be brief, but I think it kind of dovetails from my last point, which is, I mean, I'm not sure I share the view that there is no comparison between the U.S. and Chinese presence in the region or footprint of the region. Now, if we're talking specifically in military terms, that's very true. And Joel has rightly alluded to and written about the fact that the Chinese presence in the region in Djibouti is quite modest. And if you put together our assets all across this wider Red Sea, it's a very different story. But I think we collectively are at risk of thinking about this in outdated terms, and that is the kind of more integrated, more expansive vision of power or great power in the region that I'm talking about. There's no comparison in terms of the military footprint. There's also no comparison by contrast in terms of the economic footprint. Chinese trade on both sides of the Red Sea, both in the GCC and Africa, has long surpassed the U.S., and I think that gap is due to widen. And so I think when you hear about withdrawal, it's not only a security, but it's a more complex mix of diplomacy, economics, and military that is, I think, part of contributing to that narrative.
Thank you, Zach. I think those are good points. Patricia, to you, if you have any response to that specific question.
I think Zach pretty much summed it up perfectly. So I think militarily, obviously, the United States has a much larger presence and footprint out in the region, but China is just there economically. If you've so we actually traveled to Ethiopia and to Djibouti for this study, and it's just, going around Addis Ababa, there are Chinese signs everywhere, Chinese construction sites and workers. And so China is very much present in the region. We didn't travel to the Middle East as much, so I wouldn't, and perhaps Zach could speak to that. But, they're very much there. They have surpassed the United States as Africa and the GCC's largest trading partners. China, not only numbers-wise makes a splash, but it also makes a lot of symbolic splash too. So it's signed dozens of MOUs with African and Arab states since the BRI's inception. It's pledged billions of dollars in financing for infrastructure projects, and it's created special economic zones and industrial parks throughout the region. So it is very much there heavily economically. And again, this economic presence has also been accompanied by extensive diplomatic and cultural engagement. So since 2000, China has convened FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which includes 53 African states, the Commission of the AU, and so on. And this has become a really high-profile platform for Chinese leaders and African counterparts to regularly meet. There's a similar platform, the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum, which includes 21 members of the Arab League. They meet every 2 years since 2004. They bring all the leaders over to Beijing. So diplomatically, China is very much there. And finally, even grassroots engagement. So the United States, its traditional strength has been in public health and in agriculture and civil society work in Africa, but China has also really very much stepped its soft power game. So I think there are more, I forgot what the exact stats are, but there are more African students studying now in China. Xi Jinping has pledged 50,000 scholarships and 50,000 training opportunities for Africans over the next 3 years in 2018. It's opened Confucius Institutes throughout the Red Sea arena. So China is very much there. So I don't know if it's just a perception of the US shrinking, at least vis-a-vis China, but it is a reality as well, especially when you talk about economics and diplomatic engagement.
Thank you. A lot there to we could unpack. Joel, to you, if you had any additional points you'd like to make.
Well, I can't really speak to regional perspective so much, but I think, the overall view that China is rising, the U.S. is in decline. That's a theme that we hear all the time in the Indo-Pacific region, and it's a theme that China in particular has been. It's a narrative that China has been leveraging and spreading to kind of create the expectation that the future allies with China, so you better bandwagon, you better not resist, and the U.S. Is not a resident power, and it's not always going to be there for you. And so, that strikes me as a message they're probably trying to spread in other regions as well. Now, how much that's actually based on fact and how much of that is a myth, I think, is something that we could explore. I don't think the U.S. has actually left either of these regions, the Indo-Pacific or the Red Sea, despite sort of claims of some of the prognosticators and some of the pundits on the Chinese side. I think we're clearly there and doing a lot. I do think China tends to market its presence quite a lot better than we do. And they get quite a lot of mileage out of a very, very small, especially in the military, but they get a lot of mileage out of the counter-piracy and the peacekeeping, which is a very, very small, very low-cost commitment, but they market it. They have constant news reporting on these sorts of things. I'm not sure from a strategic communications perspective that we do quite as good of a job. I'd also say that, to this administration's credit, they seem to be recognizing that we are at a competitive disadvantage in the economic realm, especially in the infrastructure arena. And there has been some fresh thinking about how to renew U.S. engagement in that area through the BUILD Act and through the new Development Finance Institution. I think they're just kind of getting started. I don't think the U.S. is ever going to match China's level of effort in these things. But on the same time, it's U.S. The core of U.S. power is in relationships with allies and partners. And if there's a way to develop our effort with Japan, with the European powers, and so on, and to pool those resources based on common values, then I think that's something where we could potentially have some kind of competitive edge in some of those areas.
Excellent points. As a follow-up, to that, I'm in agreement with all three of you by and large, but the issue I have is that the Red Sea traditionally was kind of an afterthought, especially for the U.S. Navy, which is the dominant maritime force in this region, and the priority, of course, was the Gulf for a whole host of geostrategic and global economic concerns. Now the Red Sea is suddenly very, very crowded. You have, obviously, part of that is driven by the impact of the Yemen war throughout the wider region. Part of that is because the Chinese are more interested in the strategic choke point. The French and the British also have been signaling that they want to do more. We don't really know yet exactly, at least when it comes to the UK, what that more looks like yet. And then also you have this potential economic boom, which will in turn lead to greater political clout of some African states. Continuously Ethiopia is brought up, the possibility of Kenya and Tanzania and other Eastern African states, kind of having greater prosperity because of the maritime domain, helping to modernize their economy and giving them more flexibility. But so the issue I want to move into now is it seems that the consensus, at least, is that the U.S. is still dominant strategically, or at least in terms of military assets and kind of security concerns in the region. The Chinese have the edge economically. Clearly, both are invested in the Red Sea region in different ways, but they're invested. So returning, Joel, to your point in your introduction about cooperation. Now, this is a tense word now in the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, the concept of cooperating with a major competitor. What would that look like in your eyes? If we were going to cooperate in the Red Sea, what are some targets? Are we talking things like military operations other than war, peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief? We're talking about economic projects. What kind of things pop out into your minds when it comes to cooperative relationship? Joel.
Okay, so I guess you can break this down into different areas. So on the economic side, the dominant viewpoint, I think, in the U.S. right now is that we shouldn't have anything to do with the Belt and Road Initiative, that it's just completely, it's tarnished, it's about fueling authoritarianism, it's about corrupt practices and so on. So that's the narrative. I think, BRI is quite complex. There are all sorts of different types of projects that fall under this. A lot of other countries other than the U.S. have taken more of a fine-grained approach to this and have said, well, look, if China wants to invest in high-quality projects, so in other words, things that are actually creating jobs, following environmental standards, and basically adhering to international norms, then should we in principle always oppose those sorts of things? And a lot of other countries, including Japan, other US allied and partner countries, are saying we shouldn't necessarily. We should actually try to shape China. We should encourage them to put their money into things that are doing good for these regions. And so that's something that I think probably the next administration, not this one, but the next administration that comes in will have to wrestle with the question is that, what kind of approach do we want to take with the BRI? Should we encourage US companies to get involved with this, given that there are risks, very, very clear risks of IP being stolen and so on, so what should our approach be with BRI? But that could be a basis of cooperation if there's a way to do it that safeguards our interests. In the military, so I think, the most important thing is that we find a way to coexist in this region. We have military operations that are going on every day. There have been some dangerous incidents in the past. There's a prospect of an incident, if it blows up, becomes a crisis. If we're in a context of great power competition, neither side's going to back down as easily. So how do we avoid those incidents and manage them when they happen? And so that's something that the countries on the ground in Djibouti and then other countries, if China does more bases, these talks need to continue. So we need to figure out how we can coexist. Do we need more formalized rules of behavior, for some of those air and maritime interactions in the region? And then sort of on non-traditional security, I think there are common interests, but there are certain risks, I think, from the U.S. view of getting into that. So does that legitimize the PLA? Does that legitimize China's aggressive actions in Asia if we cooperate with them outside of Asia? Does that give them a vantage point into our military capabilities that they will use to develop their own warfighting skill sets and so on? So there are a lot of trade-offs that go on with that. So it's not as simple. I would suggest that counter piracy is a good thing to think about. Piracy itself isn't nowadays such a huge problem off the Horn of Africa, but it's something that we've cooperated in the past. I think it would give naval force some chance to interact directly and develop what some folks call operational trust. And so how do you get along with an adversary military if you're operating close quarters? So I would give those crews some up close interaction with the other side, even if they're not really solving a piracy problem, but it could be useful because those crews could probably meet again in less fortuitous circumstances. And I think there should be cooperation, but again, in a context of competition, it's sometimes it could be there are downsides and it can be harder to pull that off politically.
Thank you, Joel. I absolutely appreciate those. We'll go a different order. Zach, if you have any comments on the issue of cooperation, then we'll go to Patricia. Zach, to you.
Yeah, thanks. If I'm honest, I'm skeptical, at least in the near term, just given the obvious narrative that has emerged in so many regions and on a national scale. I mean, you look at the events of today, and things continue to. The tension continues in that relationship globally. So you alluded, I think, rightly to the point that Africa was the western shores of the Red Sea, at least in Africa, was until quite recently seen as a domain of kind of marginal strategic consequence. And to that end, it was a place that both sides explored the idea of cooperation, not least the Chinese. I mean, when I worked as a U.S. diplomat, I mean, there were a number of occasions in which the U.S. or the Chinese counterparts sought and explored opportunities for coordination in this part of the Red Sea and in the Horn of Africa. How deep those ultimately went is open to debate, but I think that environment is much harder at the moment. So I'm skeptical, if I'm honest, in the near term.
Okay. Interesting point. Absolutely. I honestly, being perfectly forthcoming, I'm a bit skeptical as well. But Patricia, maybe you can change my mind. So to you.
So unfortunately, I don't know if I'm going to change your mind, and perhaps I'll be confirming it more. But I also think that cooperation between the United States and China, despite how much it's needed right now, is going to be very difficult. As everyone alluded to, the COVID outbreak, especially since then, it has essentially exacerbated the bilateral relationship that's been souring over a host of issues, from trade to human rights and strategic concerns about China's rise and so on. And I don't see an upturn in the relationship anytime soon. So cooperation will be very difficult. If you look just domestically as well, it's not very popular right now. Recent polls show that American citizens' views of China have reached unprecedented lows. So there's really little incentive for any political party, Republican or Democrat, or any administration really to prioritize cooperation. But the fact is, especially if and when COVID-19 peaks in places like the Horn of Africa, it will require significant humanitarian and economic assistance if we don't want to see failed states and a destabilized region. So this means we need to work with key players like China, as well as other major regional and global players, to coordinate efforts and contributions. In the past, the United States and China did work together, at least in a limited fashion, during the Ebola virus outbreak in Africa. So we coordinated to help the African Union establish the African CDC. Obviously, there has been a rethinking of this by the current US administration. So it will be difficult, but I think some low-hanging fruit is at the very least, pursuing dialogues with our Chinese counterparts on where might we coordinate in areas of mutual interest, whether it's public health crises or security of slots or supporting various regional diplomatic mechanisms that are trying to figure out the various conflicts that are out in the region. So that's low-hanging fruit. We also will need to cooperate or at least coordinate on debt forgiveness, loans. So as I said, China, as well as other players in this region, are facing lots of pressure to do something for African states that are dealing with the economic damage from the coronavirus outbreak. But there are concerns on all sides. Nobody wants to bail out China's loans, and the Chinese say, well, we don't want to bail out Africa's debts to other countries on our taxpayers' backs. So there's sort of the skepticism on all sides. And so I think this will require coordination to help really the most vulnerable states that are dealing with economic challenges. But it's not going to be easy.
Zach, I'll give it back. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I just wanted to say, I mean, my skepticism is definitely in the current circumstances. I think it's possible in a different context or a different moment, cooperation. But I just wanted to make one point about in the interim. I think we've seen this play out in Europe, in the Middle East, and other places that I think we also have to be careful about overemphasizing great power competition in the region. In the space between here and cooperation, because I think turning greater U.S. resources and attention to China makes sense. I think we got to be careful about calibrating our message. I mean, discussions with states and diplomats across both sides of the Red Sea, by and large, suggest little interest in being caught in a sort of new Cold War, and no interest in choosing sides. And so for U.S. policymakers to place this kind of singular emphasis on Chinese threats, or to create a perception that it's only interested now in the Red Sea or the Western Indian Ocean for the sake of competition with China would be a mistake. So I think deepening our bilateral relationships, being more responsive to partners' priorities, moving beyond just a traditional security lens. These are all ways I think we can do better. And I think the idea of demonstrating the value of a U.S. partnership, is sound diplomacy in its own right, but is also probably a better way to check Chinese influence. Thanks.
Thank you, Zach. I think those are good points. I mean, Patricia, to your comments, I felt a little bit like we were back in East Asia or the Pacific talking about low-hanging fruit for cooperation when it comes to cooperation with China. But I think I want to give the opportunity for our participants, the wider audience, to ask questions. So I'm just going to go into one final question, but quickly an interjection by me, and that is I think there's also an issue when it comes to talking about the Red Sea specifically and U.S.-China. There's a different methodology that both states employ. I mean, China is very much into the strategic pomp and circumstance, banging the drum in every small little thing they do, with a lot of the work that the U.S. does, which is substantial in a lot of different ways. It doesn't go heralded because the U.S. government, the United States, has learned the lesson to keep our footprint kind of under the radar in a lot of respects. So that's also, I think, a data point that's worth reflecting on is how much do we want to kind of change the methodology we've used to great effect? I mean, like looking at a lot of the Red Sea cooperative efforts going on right now on the east and west coast between, you have conversations between the Saudis and the Jordanians and, the Sudanese and Egypt and Ethiopia and a whole host of countries. The United States has been involved in a lot of those. It's not leading any of them. It's just offering its support to whatever the region decides, and that gains a lot of import in the capitals of the region. But at the same time, it's not going to be heralded in a lot of narratives outside of those specific, kind of senior leader conversations. So it's another interesting kind of data point that frames things. But to go into the final question I have before opening it up to the audience, let's talk about the future. Let's talk about trend lines. And let's be unabashedly from a U.S. point of view here. When it comes to the Red Sea and the U.S. interest in this region, what are key things that you would target as should be our emphasis? And not just general, like greater diplomacy or more intense diplomacy, or the continuation of our security, status. But specific things that you think would be very helpful, not only for regional stability, but also for U.S. interests. I think that would be something I would find very interesting. It may include China as part of your calculation. It may not. And I think that in of itself would be an interesting data point of whether or not you are calculating China as part of that mathematical equation in your own head. I know that's not an easy question to jump right into. So I will, the first one to turn on their mic and go will be the one we start with. But I turn it over to the three of you for any responses.
Sure, Jeff. I'll take a whack at that. So I guess we can kind of disaggregate that into sort of material interests and then U.S. values. On the material interest side, this region is of critical importance for our trade, for shipping that transits the Red Sea, also for oil, energy, the transit that comes from the Red Sea region that goes elsewhere, even if it doesn't go us because there's a global commodities market. We have material interests, we have trade and investment and so on. On the value side, we have an interest in promoting democracy and human rights. That's something, and China is involved in both of those things in different ways. I think there are more common interests with China on the material interest side, frankly, because they have an interest in maintaining the freedom of navigation in the region. They don't have any territorial claims as they do in the Indo-Pacific that's driving a more assertive approach. They have an interest in countering piracy and in countering state-sponsored violence in the region. On the value side, I think the situation is somewhat different. Some people kind of make a lot of this idea that China wants to spread authoritarianism. I'm not sure that the Chinese rub their act together, that they can do that in a systematic, but they are certainly spreading the tools of authoritarianism, and I think it's easier for them to work with authoritarian governments. So that's something that conflicts fairly clearly with our values. They're also, lining up countries in the region to take China's view on things like what's happening in Hong Kong or in Xinjiang and so on. The report covers that, and they've actually been quite successful in that. So from the perspective of our values, I think that's an area where we will be competing. We will be in a competition. It might not be as clearly as democracy versus authoritarian, but there will be problems as China gets more entrenched in the region, I think.
Thank you, Joel. Patty, I saw that your hand went up about the same time, so to you.
Sure, thank you. And I think Joel did a great job of sort of laying out some of the different categories. And if I could just drill down a little bit more. So one of the major buckets of recommendations that we put forth in the USIP report is that we need to recognize that China will be engaged in the Red Sea arena. It's not gonna go away. It's gonna stick around. And so one of the things that the United States can do, both for the interests of the region as well as our own interests, is to support Red Sea states to better manage China's growing presence. So how can we do that? We can do that by building institutional capacity, strengthening civil society, equipping current and next generation leaders in this Red Sea region to better leverage China's growing economic, diplomatic, and military engagement in the region. So I hope folks who are interested in some of the specifics can go look up our report. But some of the ways we recommend doing this is by, for instance, providing technical assistance to Red Sea arena governments and civil society actors to review foreign loan packages and major economic projects for transparency, economic viability, and sustainability. The US has been doing this in certain parts, like in Southeast Asia, to success. And so I think this is something that could be replicated in the region. Also, I think continuing to invest and expanding in existing initiatives like the Fulbright program, Peace Corps, and Young African Leaders Initiative, and strengthening fact-based journalism by offering trainings on media professionalism and financial literacy, and ensuring that in this age of disinformation, journalists and citizens have access to a diverse array of resources, for instance. And also just serving as a beacon for, or as a model of a free and open society with an open internet and so on. China's been very good at sort of promoting why its system, for instance, is good for political control and stability, but we haven't done that as much as well. So thinking about those sorts of public diplomacy efforts should also be at the top of the agenda.
Thank you. Yeah, the key things there. Yeah, I'm particularly interested in the institutional capacity building you talked about, and technical assistance, as well as legal assistance cooperation. I think those are, I've heard those directly from regional participants that I've discussed with in various meetings from time to time. Zac, to you for any specific thoughts you had on this question.
I mean, a lot of different places to take this. I think in the region, there are a sort of less sexy, longer term agenda that we can do, and I can talk about it. I do think there are some opportunities in the immediate term. Again, whether or not we in this environment with this administration's approach to the region are likely to take that up is a matter for debate. But I think just looking at the situation, there's, as Patty I think alluded to, there is a real opportunity to demonstrate global leadership on debt relief and on COVID response in the region. And obviously, there's been some back and forth with the Chinese already on that, but there's really an absence from the picture. And I think that's would be a fairly, I wouldn't say easy, but a very accessible way to enter the debate in some of these countries. So that is, I think, in the near term. In the longer term, this is a buzzword, I know, but it does mean leveraging comparative advantages. Our existing partnerships, working multilaterally, maintaining our, primacy as a security partner. That can't be the all game, but it does remain an important one in a lot of these countries. Offering development and technical expertise, as Patty alluded to, and I think emphasizing sectors where U.S. businesses can bring something unique to the table. In economic terms, as I said, I don't think the U.S. can match the kind of loans or trade or commercial investments that Beijing is likely to continue pumping into the region, and we shouldn't chase after that in unrealistic terms. But it does mean, finding those kind of advantages, and Joel and others have written about this as well. But the kind that encourages competition, raises standards. Where do we identify downstream investments, whether in high tech or energy or service sectors where U.S. companies can add value? I think there's areas to explore in terms of skills and technology transfer, a place where China has come up short in parts of the region. More to say, but I'll leave it there for now, and we can, sounds like, let others jump in.
Yeah, well said, Zac. Thank you. I'm going to use the moderator privilege to add a few points that I think that my recommendations. I think, and I'm speaking primarily kind of from the security point of view, but I think we can't keep. I think we have to remain fixated on the actual Red Sea. I think if we get sidetracked too much on getting pulled into either the African side of the Red Sea or into the Middle East side of it, we're going to get away from kind of the key prioritization point for the United States government, and that is that strategic choke point. there's a lot of different opportunities related to diplomacy and technical assistance and institutional capacity building. But I think the focus should remain on the Red Sea. I also believe that we need to, the U.S. needs to, in the long run, get better about connecting all the various really excellent efforts that are done. A lot of embassy teams around throughout Africa and throughout the Middle East are doing some really great programs. Again, unheralded. There needs to be connection between these efforts, and and when they're connected, it needs to be communicated better in the public sphere. To add one final data point from the COVID crisis is that we asked a lot of our alumni, and we have a lot from this region, about some insights on how they see the response from China on COVID, how they see the U.S. response, and it's been a very mixed bag. Honestly, I agree that there's a real opportunity here, because it's kind of been a plague on both your houses, so to speak, from a lot of regional health experts, diplomats, retired security officers who are like, obviously we don't trust the information coming out of China regarding COVID, but clearly we've seen from the United States that things have not gone very well for it as in the same vein. But they also know that while the U.S. doesn't provide as much in terms of quantity of assistance that the Chinese are offering, what they do get from the United States is a reliable quality, and it can be pinpointed to specific technical deficiencies in combating the virus. So I think that is something in the short term that can be levied to great effect. So I will shut up there. I will now open it up to our participants in the room, who, if any of you would like to ask questions of any of the presenters here today, I open the floor to you. I would ask you to raise your hand, and the way you do that is at the bottom of your screen there will be 4 buttons that you'll see on the far right. The far right button will look like a little person with their hand raised. So if you click that, I will notice it, and then I can turn the floor over to you to ask your question. I would just ask you to identify yourself, if you could, for our presenters. So the opportunity is open. Okay, people are going to remain shy. That's fine. If you change your mind in the few minutes we have left, just raise your hand and I will notice it. One kind of final thing to ask you 3 presenters from my end, if I have the floor still, and I'm going to be selfish to use this. One of the things that I am interested about is the concept of the Indo-Pacific. And since all 3 of you have, well, okay, I have to stop there. I see that we do have one question, one hand raised from our presenters. So, General Wolf, to you, I'll turn the floor over to you, sir.
I just lost you. Okay. So just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. I've just lost. Very good. Okay. Hey, first of all, thank you to all our speakers. I intended to listen to the whole thing, the whole presentation, but your presentations, but I got pulled away on something else, unfortunately, another video teleconference. I would be interested in kind of hearing if you would offer one thing that each of you would offer to policymakers. What does the next administration take on here regarding the challenges associated with the Red Sea? You've given a wonderful menu of ideas, but regardless of which administration it is, a new administration comes in full of vigor and great ideas, and whether it's Trump 2 or whether it is Biden. And so, is there something that you would offer that would make enormous sense, that you would say, above all things, do this, as a way to jumpstart the efforts across both sides of the Red Sea, looking at both continents, but something that they might take on in a way that would help the policy making teams. I'll pause there and I'll pick up your answers. I may have to drop out and come back in, but don't wait for me. Thank you, and thank you for your participation.
Thank you, sir. Patricia, I'm going to pick on you first because I'm trying to switch up the order here. So, if you had to pick the priority, what would it be?
Wow, well, that's very hard always to pick the one priority, and I think I may have to reiterate, the first bucket that I had mentioned from our report, and this is essentially increasing our own diplomatic, economic, and civil society engagement to, again, help Red Sea states better manage China's growing presence. And I think one other, and this is along the lines of building institutional capacity, strengthening civil society, and so on, that I've already listed. But I would say that the U.S. has a challenge here in packaging this not as something that we're doing to compete with China in the region, which again, as the other speakers have alluded to, the region really, many folks out there hate that. They don't want to have to choose between the two powers. So how do we do this without making this about China and making this about really the United States partnership with the region? And so I think that's a challenge that is on the next administration's table. And I would say that the United States has a lot to build on. We are already recognized for the traditional contributions to security support, good governance, agriculture, health, and education. So if this is, this is not just a PR. So there needs to be a PR aspect. And Jeff, you were alluding to this. We need to sort of learn how to package this well and talk about it publicly. But at the same time, Africa, Red Sea has always been sort of on the margins. And it's only received prominence in recent, over the last year or two, because it's because of China, right? And for instance, when the current administration talked about our new Africa strategy, it was really a China strategy and not an Africa strategy. So I think avoiding that sort of trap will be important and should be prioritized.
Okay, thank you so much, Patricia. I know it's not an easy question to answer. So let me see. Zach, okay, you're offered up.
I've got a 1A and a 1B in response to General Wolf's question. I think one is more on the diplomatic side, and the second on the military side, though they're related. The first, and we haven't had a lot of space to talk about it here, but there's been some attempts on both sides of the region to try to come up with a multilateral framework in which to a kind of venue in which these states in the Red Sea, both the states from the Gulf and the Middle East and the African states, can come together, talk about conflict prevention, talk about cooperation, talk about shared economic interests. It's really been kind of a free-for-all up to date. And so this is a good idea. I think it's a good idea. We put out a report about it at Brookings late last year. But it's an area in which the U.S. has been too absent. I mean, largely absent from the discussion. And I think this kind of framework is one of those ways that we could draw on our existing relationships as kind of force multipliers and help prevent a situation in which any of the states in the region are sort of preyed upon, but also provide an offset to the Chinese approach, which is by and large bilateral and hopes to remain bilateral. So I think that's a missed opportunity on the diplomatic side. On the military side, I alluded to this earlier, but I think we struggle in terms of how we think about this both militarily, but also in a broader, more integrated fashion because of existing patterns or seams. And we've all talked about this before, but this question of bureaucratic seams. Currently, the Red Sea and even the military bases in Djibouti aren't officially part of the wider Indo-Pacific. The Deputy National Security Advisor alluded recently that may be changing, that there may be a more expansive view, and I think we've shown some flexibility in that in terms of how we sort of adopted our approach to the Indo-Pacific. I think those dividing lines or those areas of responsibility, they obviously have to be drawn somewhere, but they split authorities between multiple combatant commands, as we know, and I think that can limit the Pentagon's ability to orient itself in terms of these kind of hybrid questions. So I think there's an opportunity to revisit those in light of changing strategic realities and made flexible enough to respond to new challenges. That doesn't mean we have to redraw combatant commands, but it does mean some greater flexibility. And that sounds like a process answer to a substantive question, but I think it is the thing that's necessary to try to answer that substantive question. I've had discussions with folks, in the Middle East, in the Horn, and at the Pentagon on this, and I think a lot of people don't feel sufficiently organized in a way that they can address what is a changing set of realities. Thanks.
Thank you, Zach. Joel, before you go into you, Zach, just to follow up, I will send a note to AFRICOM and to CENTCOM that you want to redraw the boundaries this afternoon. It's a joke. I'm just making a bad joke. Joel, to you.
Sure. So I'll follow Zach's lead in throwing a couple of things out. First, something that's very narrow but very practical that this administration and the next will have to deal with, which is China's relations with Iran. As we're getting to the end of the UN Security Council restrictions on selling major arms to Iran. Russia has already signaled its desire to get into that market. China is in some ways the perfect partner for Iran. They may sell some pretty nasty stuff to Iran if they're not if they don't feel sufficient restraints. So that's something I think we need to watch and probably try to, before it happens, build a pretty nice coalition to dissuade China from getting into that, because that could pose some really big operational problems, and especially in light of recent and now somehow forgotten major tensions in Iran-U.S. relations. So that's the first thing. The second thing is just broader on messaging. So this is kind of a theme here. I think we need to stick to a positive message highlighting our values, our commitment to the region. There's a tendency to go out there and to vilify China in disparate regions of the world and to kind of knock them for all the nasty things they're doing. I think audiences get that. I think they're already quite aware of that, and they don't need us to tell it. And it's also not an attractive message. It's something that China historically has tried to stay away from that. They've tried to highlight their positives and to kind of stay away from explicitly vilifying the U.S. They've kind of shifted from that recently with the whole Wolf Order diplomacy, and I think they've gotten a lot of blowback from that. But that's something that we don't want to. I think that's something that we have something to learn from China. Project a positive message, but not just that, but have it be a consistent message with our values and practices at home, which is under real difficulty of late. So strategic communications and messaging, I think that's something where we need to up our game a little bit.
Thank you, Joel. Before we move on to the next question from Nick, the two quick things I would add. I agree with something that Patricia said. The priority in terms of communications for us is, and this echoes what Joel said as well, talk about China without talking about China. And there's a way to do that. I know it sounds like a nice little slogan, but there's a way to continue to do things that prepare the United States better for this potentially competitive environment without making it about China, without making it about chasing China, or reacting to China, or getting out ahead of China. There's a way to do that. And the priority in terms of security realm that I would emphasize is an emphasis on connecting the various littoral security efforts that are being done throughout the Indian Ocean rim, specifically in the Red Sea region along the African coast, because of all the regional investment in building new commercial ports and building military outposts and basing, dual use facilities. Zach has written about this extensively. A lot of states are starting to realize that the water matters a great deal. And so they need to start somewhere. And this is a niche the United States dominates and does well. And it doesn't cost a lot of money, and you can connect in a really practical way. So I think those such efforts should be a target. But Nick, I see your hand up, so I'll give the floor to you.
Jeff, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
All right, great. Yeah, no, I think question related to sort of you talk about how do you speak against China without speaking against China, and then also the broader messaging question. I think that raises another question as far as how do you act against China without acting against China that allows other states to collaborate with you without pushing them off or away from you because you make it so explicitly focused about China. So from that perspective, I'm wondering from the group, are there other partners and what their messagings and activities are as it relates to the Red Sea, where the U.S. could more closely work together with them in sort of a more coordinated fashion, and what types of messaging and alignment might they be open to collaborating with us on in order to influence regional states in the Red Sea? And additionally, what types of activities might there be that are of interest to the regional states? I think, Jeff, you kind of were starting to allude to this as it relates to what maritime infrastructure, et cetera, specifically that from that maritime security perspective, regional states would be welcome to engaging with us on, us being the US and potentially other close high-end US partners. You know, off my top of my head comes the UK, France, there might be others, where we could collaborate with them, do appropriate messaging that, again, messages against China without messaging against China, is acting against China without acting against China, to reinforce that rules-based international order. So just kind of curious to know perspectives on that, sort of boiled down to how can we act in collaborative fashions and where can we act in collaborative fashions on areas of maritime security that are relevant to these regional states that also advance our interests as it relates to sort of this broader great power competition era we live in. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick. And if the group will humor me, just because we're getting short on time, there's one more hand raised. So Nick, we'll get to your question for sure. But Nada, I see your hand is up as well. So if you'd like to ask your question and to the group, and so we can answer both to kind of close this out for today. So Nada, to you.
Yeah, thank you. I remember that all of you guys mentioned multilateralism efforts, and recently, ever since like there's not a radical shift from the Middle East to Asia, but more of a transition, I guess, to the China region. Europe hasn't necessarily seen that the best way possible, and so I was wondering. Oh, and yeah, I was wondering how could like the tensions that currently exist between like China and Washington, like how could we prevent them from derailing the efforts of multilateralism, specifically with the Western European nations and North Korea, because I think they would be key players in helping the US gain more influence in the Red Sea region.
Thank you, Nada. Okay, so we have two final questions. I'm going to close this out today. I will let it go to the first one to turn on their mic. I won't pick on anyone. Be kind in this round of questions. Patricia.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks. So maybe I'll just quickly respond in a way that might get at both of the questions that were posed. And I would say one interesting finding from our report is that despite this huge focus on China and the fact that China as a single country is the largest economic power out in the Red Sea region, actually the largest economic partner for both the Horn and the Arabian Peninsula is the European Union, if you put all the countries together. So China is not the only country out there. We certainly have allies and partners such as France, Germany, Japan, all operating out in the Red Sea arena. And I think working with them, whether it's on the economic sphere or on maritime security, as one of our participants asked about, those are all options and they should be seriously considered. From my trip out to the region, from what I understand, there have been good multilateral discussions that have involved France, Japan and Germany, the United States, and China at the table to talk about operational safety issues and so on, rules of engagement out in Djibouti, for instance, where we did see some tension in 2018 with the lasing incident and so on. So these types of things I think are good. They should be pursued, and we should continue to look not just at this, as a US-China thing, but working with our allies and partners to engage China, to engage the region.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Patricia. Joel or Zach?
Sure, Jeff. Yeah. So I guess just briefly on the maritime safety piece. So again, I'll come back to the point that our key asset in the region is our network of allies and like-minded countries. And there are a number of other countries there that are present that have similar interests and similar values in how we should approach this issue. We've been doing quite a lot over the last dozen years on counter-piracy in a multilateral format. CTF 151. The European Union has their own similar operation out there, and then certainly with the various countries' bases in Djibouti. As aside from China, these are all U.S. allies, and so how can we talk with our friends together to basically confront China with a united front of sorts, to use their terminology, and say, look, there are certain rules of the road that we want to try to preserve in this region. There are ways of employing military power that are for the region's good and not for in an assertive way, as China has done on a couple of occasions in Djibouti. So I think we can be most effective when we coordinate with those countries, that we've done some of that, and then invite China in and to say, look, there's a consensus here on how military power should be used. You can accept that, or you can act in a different way. But to present China with that kind of choice, if you will, and if you want to participate in a new framework for military operations or rules of behavior, please do join us. But if you don't, you're truly going against the will of many other countries. And so that coordination, I think, is useful. It's happened to a certain degree, but it's something where I think we can do more of it.
Thank you, Joel. Well said. Zac, to you.
I think all the good ideas have been covered so far. I mean, I fully agree on that last point, and something I alluded to at the outset. Again, I think there's an understandable concern globally about engaging with the Chinese, and particularly the military. And this comes from my research in Djibouti and this forthcoming report. I understand that, the real risk of counterintelligence and those kind of things, but I do think we're also missing an opportunity, right? We can, together with our allies, as Joel mentions, we can either watch the tide come in, or we can try to shape it. And I think there has been success on the ground in Djibouti, and the limited cases in which the U.S. has coordinated both diplomatically and militarily with our allies there, and then presented China. Everyone says there that China is learning, and they're learning fast. And I think we can either keep that at arm's length, or we could be the primary ones shaping the curriculum. And I think that probably requires a larger conversation, at the Pentagon and maybe in some of these instances, trying out a different balance there, where we are more proactive, where we do take the lead in those kind of mechanisms, and as I said, set the precedent for the next 10 Chinese bases elsewhere in the region. Thanks.
Thank you, Zac. The one thing I'll add to what Nick asked, I think we can also add to the chorus of voices, and we can get those that are partnered and allied with us to do what they do well. I said that I think the problem is that we're throwing everyone into a big pot, and instead of focusing on what everyone has a specialty or capability of doing, I think asking our British allies to have a heavy hand in the Indian Ocean region, and even the Red Sea, may be a bridge too far, but asking them to enhance what they're doing in the Med, which is a little bit outside of the theater, but there's a lot there that could alleviate responsibilities that, say, the French in the United States would then have to worry about when it comes to the Eastern Med. The French are a key partner in this region just because they are an Indian Ocean power. I mean, they have their overseas territories in the Indian Ocean. And then the big one that is out there is India. India, I mean, the Great Seduction has been ongoing for decades now. It's always trying to pull India into the Pacific, where the India focused in the Indian Ocean region is a much more natural sell, and is something that the Indian, especially the Indian Navy, is more preferential towards. So drawing their attention towards Africa, where they've already enhanced their engagement substantially, could pay a lot of overlapping dividends, and that sense. But anyway, to wrap us out, and we're a little bit over time, and for that I will take the blame. To Joel, to Patricia, to Zac, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules to join us today. Well, I'm sure we'll do follow-ups. Any of you who are participating, if you want to see what they've actually written, if you haven't encountered it before, you visit them at their home institutions, or email me, and I will send you PDFs of the reports. I follow all of their work, and I will continue to do so in the future. But thank the three of you for doing the heavy lifting today. We'll be in touch with probably more of these. I won't let you out of my sights for your comments and your expertise in the future. But to everyone, thank you, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone, take care. Thank you.